Wait, just wait a little while. Soon Haarmann's coming with a smile. With his little hatchet blade, you'll be chopped, freshly flayed. From your eyes, he'll make a stew. From your rump, some bacon too. From your guts, he'll craft some links, and the rest? That's waste, he thinks. This text belongs to the Haarmann song. A jazz version of the song was in the top 10 of the German charts for 4 weeks in 1961. And that despite the fact that it was not yet 40 years since the murderous Fritz Haarmann roamed through Hanover, Germany. To this day, he is considered one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. Not only in Germany, but all over the world. Today, we look at how Fritz Haarmann became a man who killed more than 20 boys, and why he is still called the Werewolf of Hanover today. It is Friday, June 13th, 1924. A few children are playing in the center of Hanover on the banks of the Lena River. The river runs through the German city. Then, as now, the riverside along the Old Town is a popular destination for outings. But when children playing on June 13th, 1924 fish a human skull out of the river, the happy atmosphere there is gone once and for all. This is the 4th time in 2 months that a severed human head has been found in the Lena. Fear is now spreading among the residents of Hanover, because quite obviously, a serial killer is on the loose in the city, which even then had more than 400,000 residents. And soon it will turn out that this serial killer unfortunately has many more people on his conscience. More than 20 young men have found death at his hands. He was particularly active as a murderer in the years 1923 and 1924, and that despite being on the police's radar the whole time. But how could it still happen that Fritz Haarmann was able to go around killing unsuspectingly? And who is the man who, about 100 years ago, put an entire city in fear and terror? Fritz Haarmann was born on October 25th, 1879 in Hanover. He had 6 siblings and came from a middle-class home, at least on paper. On his mother's side, the Haarmann family had a small fortune. However, after an accident at work, his father was unemployed. Fritz was the youngest of the 6 siblings. When he was born, his mother was already 41 years old. At the time, this was a real rarity. Even as a child, Fritz worked in a factory at his father's insistence. He would later say that his father isolated him from his peers. The two did not have a good relationship. Although Fritz was close to his mother, she was ill and bedridden. That's why his father was the main presence in his everyday life. And they hate each other's guts. So much so that they try to get each other thrown in jail by making various accusations. Fritz claims that his father's work accident was in fact the concealed murder of his superior. Fritz's father, on the other hand, repeatedly threatened to have his youngest son committed to an insane asylum. Fritz Haarmann later claimed to have been sexually abused as a child by his older brother. He also said that his father had tried to assault him. In fact, one of Fritz Haarmann's brothers was convicted of sexually assaulting a 12-year-old girl. In 1886, 6-year-old Fritz was enrolled at the then public school on Engelbosteler Dam. His behavior was considered exemplary. Otherwise, however, his performance was well below average, a circumstance that would run through his entire educational career. Fritz never completed school. At the age of 16, he's drawn to Breisgau, where he attends a non-commissioned officer's school from 1895. Due to signs of mental and cognitive disorders, he's repeatedly admitted to the military hospital there. Because of these circumstances, he's unable to complete the non-commissioned officer's school. He returns to his home in northern Germany. However, his health problems remain even after his return. In nearby Hildesheim, he is diagnosed with congenital mental deficiency. At the end of the 19th century, this usually meant a lack of sensation and reason. The term was considered a synonym for an intellectual disability. Today, the term is no longer used in a diagnostic context. In addition, Fritz Haarmann was arrested and convicted of indecent assault on a minor, i.e., of underage boys. When he first committed and documented assaults, Fritz Haarmann was only 17 years old. He is said to have repeatedly lured young boys into building entrances and cellars in order to assault them there. After that, he was committed to various provincial, sanatorium, and nursing homes in the province of Hanover from March to December 1897. However, he escaped from there, presumably with the help of his parents. He moved to Zurich in Switzerland, where a relative of his mother's lived. He worked as a painter. Fritz was taken in by him and initially worked for a while at a shipyard, then for a Swiss pharmacist. In 1899, he returns to Hanover, the city where he later becomes a serial killer. At the urging of his family, he becomes engaged to a woman named Erna Löwert. She becomes pregnant, but has the child aborted for unknown reasons. From 1900, things seem to be going well for Haarmann. He continues to see Erna and works as a soldier. This time, he does well, unlike at NCO school. When their mother dies in 1901, Fritz and his siblings quarrel over the inheritance. The family is even more disrupted than before. And at the end of the year, Fritz's health deteriorates again. He suffers repeated attacks of weakness and is forced to withdraw from military service. He then tries to sue his father for maintenance payments, but is rejected. Instead, Fritz receives a small disability pension from then on. Fritz and his fiancée Erna set up a fish shop together at today's An der Lutherkirche 9, trying to make a living. But things don't go well, and neither does their relationship. In the end, Erna kicks Fritz out, and that's when the downward spiral begins. Fritz Haarmann gets by mainly as a petty criminal and thief. In 1912, he's convicted again for having sex with a minor. The police have a record of Fritz as a dangerous mental patient. Fritz Haarmann is sentenced to 5 years in prison for several thefts, and he begins his sentence in 1913. He's not released from custody until 1918, having spent the entire First World War in prison. But even after his release, Fritz Haarmann has no intention of living on disability payments alone. Fritz first rents a room at Sellerstrasse 27, officially as a shop, supposedly to do office work there. But in fact, Haarmann lives there. From this small room, Fritz Haarmann launches his next money-making scheme. He begins buying cheap meat and bone scraps to make aspic. He then sells this product at low prices. At the time, no one knows that Fritz Haarmann kills at least one person in his room at Sellerstrasse 27, and that years later there will be a rumor that the meat products sold by Fritz may not have contained only animal remains. In 1918, a 17-year-old schoolboy disappears in Hanover. Friedel Rothe is even wanted by the police. They also search Fritz Haarmann's apartment. Friedel's friends had told them about a distinguished gentleman they had met in a cafe. This fine gentleman had introduced himself as a detective superintendent and had enticed them away. He had then assaulted them. Friedel, in particular, had become very close to this man. He told his friends that he regularly met with the alleged detective superintendent and had even been to his apartment. The man's address was found through his friends. It was Fritz Haarmann, who was, of course, no detective superintendent. The investigators pay Fritz a visit and search his apartment on Sellerstrasse. However, they do not search thoroughly enough. The fact that the severed head of Friedel Rothe, wrapped in newspaper, is lying behind the oven remains hidden from the police. Fritz had actually taken the boy home, murdered him, and dismembered the body. Instead, the police are confronted with a naked young man lying in Fritz's bed. He is a school friend of Friedel. Fritz Haarmann is arrested again for having sex with a minor. As a suspect in the case of the missing Friedel Rothe, he is forgotten. And after a while, so is the case itself. Today, it is speculated that the police may not have looked too closely at the case, and for good reason. Because Fritz Haarmann was a police informer from 1918 onwards. This means that he worked as an informer for the police, providing them with information from the criminal underworld. The police only ever considered Fritz a small-time criminal. But he had valuable information that helped them get to the really big fish. For example, he helped convict a gang that had produced counterfeit money. And at least once, he even helped track down a missing person. So, for the police, he was naturally a valuable contact. Fritz Haarmann also attracted the attention of neighbors. The middle-aged man is never seen with a woman. Instead, young guys are often coming and going at his place. He also repeatedly uses the services of homosexual male prostitutes. He can be found at familiar meeting places, for example behind Café Krupke, which still exists today. And in October 1919, he meets a person who will stay by his side until his death sentence. In October 1919, Fritz meets a young man named Hans Grans. Hans is considerably younger than Fritz. He's only 18 years old, while Fritz is 39 at the time. They meet in the homosexual scene. Allegedly, Hans has heard through acquaintances that Fritz would pay for sex. But the two also get closer beyond that and begin a kind of relationship. The two commit thefts together. Hans spends a lot of time with Fritz and basically lives with him. He takes care of Fritz's bills and writes letters for him. Fritz admires the young man's intelligence. Nevertheless, the two often quarrel. Among other things, because Hans is said to have often invited women over and spent money on prostitutes. The two men repeatedly broke up, only to get back together again. Fritz Haarmann later said of this time, "When Hans kissed me, when he held me so lovingly and caressed me, then I was gone. Then he could do whatever he wanted with me." To make money, Fritz Haarmann no longer only deals in cheap horse meat, but also in clothing. He and Hans steal clothes that are hung out to dry in backyards. Then they sell the clothes on. He sells his goods mainly in the Old Town and at the main train station in Hanover. Similar to today, Hanover was already a transportation hub back then. The large central train station right in the city center was also highly frequented in the 1920s. For Fritz and Hans, this means a lot of potential customers. Occasionally, he also begs. He then pretends to be a war invalid and swindles money out of compassionate people. Hans supports him in these shady dealings. Both Fritz and Hans are reported for theft several times. Fritz has to go to prison for a few weeks over and over again. Hans can usually talk his way out of things due to lack of evidence. Although Hans, and especially Fritz, were very extensively involved in theft and receiving in the years after 1919, as far as we know, there was no further murder. Fritz Haarmann did not strike again until 1923. Experts today assume that Fritz was satisfied with the memory of Friedel's murder for the 5 years. But in 1923, this memory had faded, and he had the urge to commit another murder to fulfill his fantasies. But it does not stop with just one more murder. More than 20 follow. In February 1923, Fritz Haarmann meets Fritz Franke at Hanover Central Station. The 16-year-old comes from Berlin. When Haarmann approached him, the two went home together. They spent the evening together, and Haarmann's friends were also there. Among them were Hans Grans and two women named Ellie and Dorchen. And it is precisely these two women who turn up a few days later at the police station at Waterloo Square. They have 2 pieces of meat with them, which they put in front of the inspector, and they tell a rather confused-sounding story. They had looked around Fritz Haarmann's apartment because a mutual acquaintance from Berlin had disappeared without a trace a few days earlier, after he was last seen at Haarmann's. During their search, Ellie and Dorchen had found a blood-smeared apron and a saucepan full of pieces of meat, and human hair was stuck to 2 of these pieces of meat. At least in connection with the sudden disappearance of Franca, this seems strange to them. That is precisely why Ellie and Dörrchen have now taken the 2 pieces of meat to the police station. A forensic doctor is called in, but he only takes a quick look at the meat. He says it is certainly pork. He does not examine the 2 pieces further. Maybe that's a fatal mistake, because if the police had investigated more closely, they could have found out that Fritz Franca from Berlin has been missing without a trace since he was last seen with Haarmann. And that Franca did not, as Haarmann claimed, drive back to his home in Berlin. After Fritz, Hans Granz, Ellie, and Dörrchen had spent the evening with Franca, Haarmann and Franca had sex. After that, Haarmann killed the youth. He opened up Franca's corpse, removed his organs, and cut off his arms and legs. Haarmann smashed Franca's head with a brick. Whether the pieces of meat in the pot were really Fritz Franca's can only be speculated on in retrospect. It is assumed that Fritz Franca was the second murder victim of Fritz Haarmann after Friedel Rothe, and the murder victim with whom a whole series begins. Throughout 1923, minors disappear in Hanover. None of them are found, although there are always clues and witness reports. One of these missing boys is Adolf Hannapel. On November 10th, 1923, he's sitting in the main hall of the Hanover train station. Adolf had to spend the night there because the 17-year-old's connecting train did not leave until the next morning, November 11th. Suddenly, he was approached by 2 men. They were policemen who had noticed the 17-year-old. They offered him a cigarette and had a brief conversation with Adolf. When they learned that he had to spend the night at the train station, they offered to help him. The teenager could spend the night at the police station. Adolf gratefully accepts the offer. He drops off his luggage at the baggage drop-off point at the station and follows the 2 men. What he does not suspect is that the 2 men are not police officers at all. Instead, they are running a perfidious scam, presumably not for the first time by far. The 2 have noticed Adolf Hannapel's high-quality clothing. According to statements made later by one of them, they wanted to have the clothes for themselves. The 2 men are Fritz Haarmann and Hans Granz, and they take Adolf not to the police station, but to Fritz's apartment. There, Adolf is murdered. After Adolf's murder, the 2 keep the dead man's clothes. They wear some of them themselves and sell the others to earn money. This business model will drag on for more than a year. After a stopover in the former Neuenstrasse, Fritz finally moves into 4 Rote Reihe in 1923. At first, he is alone. There is another crisis between him and Hans Granz. Hans moves in with another friend named Hugo Witkowski on Burgstrasse. So Fritz moves into the 7-square-meter room in the attic of the house without him. Even then, 4 Rote Reihe is over 250 years old and in rather poor condition. Today, the house no longer exists. In the attic, there was only enough space for a small board, a camp bed, a clothes horse, and 2 chairs. At that time, there was a restaurant on the ground floor of the house. At times, this inn even obtained meat from Fritz. It was not until April 1924 that they sought out another source for it. Several guests had complained that they had become ill after eating the meat and had criticized the strong taste of the meat. It is comments like these that will later fuel the rumors that Fritz Haarmann may have been peddling human flesh on his fellow citizens. After all, he murders more than 20 people in 1923 and 1924, whose bodies he has to dispose of. He has always denied this throughout his life. Nevertheless, the people of Hanover fear that they may have become cannibals. There is no real proof of this. Only the 2 loose ends that Haarmann on the one hand cut up a person and on the other hand sold meat. One of Fritz Haarmann's murders that stands out in particular was one of his last. On May 26, 1924, a boy named Friedrich Abeling, who was only 10 years old, disappeared in Hanover. Shortly before he disappeared, he asked his mother for a little money. Little Friedrich claimed that he needed the money for a school outing. This was a lie, as was later revealed when the school was asked. He left the house wearing a gray sweater with a green hem, and was never seen again. On June 17, 1924, 3 weeks after Friedrich's disappearance, a few children were playing on the street in front of his apartment building. A man asked about Friedrich's sister Alice. She is 12 years old and looks very much like her little brother who has gone missing. The man speaks briefly with Alice and says, "I am a friend of your father's. I just wanted to see you." After that, he shakes Alice's hand and leaves. The children are able to give a precise description of the man later. And on the basis of this description, people are later certain that the man who approached Alice was Fritz Haarmann. Friedrich's gray sweater is later found belonging to the mother of Fritz Haarmann's friend Hans Grans. A neighbor of Fritz Haarmann later remembers that a little boy who looked like Friedrich had once come to the Red Row and asked for Fritz. She felt sorry for the child and told him to go home. The uncle doesn't want anything good. Based on the points just mentioned, it is clear that Fritz Haarmann killed Friedrich Abeling. It is interesting that Fritz took the risk of visiting Friedrich's sister. Perhaps the similarity was a way for him to remember his youngest murder victim. Or maybe Fritz Haarmann somehow sensed at this point that his series of murders would soon end. Even before he visits Alice Abeling, all of Hanover is in an uproar. In June 1924, ironically on a Friday the 13th, a human skull is recovered from the Lena River for the 4th time within 2 months. All skulls belonged to young men. All were decapitated with sharp objects. This may sound obvious, but until the 4th discovery, the police had assured the public that the skulls found were those of people who had drowned. But after the 4th discovery, the line was searched intensively because the public no longer believed the police. It was not only the police who were on the case. The finds have long since made headlines, and hundreds of citizens have gathered along the high banks of the Leine. The authorities are also cordoned off the riverbed. Between the Bruckmühle and the Klever Gate, police forces can search there more thoroughly for further body parts. Unfortunately, they have a sad success. More than 500 body parts from at least 22 missing persons are found in the Leine. About half of the body parts had been in the water for some time. Others were thrown into the Leine just a few months or even weeks ago. The police are now searching for a serial killer. Since all known victims are male, the police suspect that it is a homosexual offender. Since homosexuality was banned at the time, around 80 men are registered with the police in Hanover for fornication with men. Among them was Fritz Haarmann, who at the time had 15 previous convictions for similar crimes. Although he had attracted attention in some of the missing persons cases, he was never convicted. That was soon to change. Although Fritz Haarmann was under police surveillance, initially without result. Ultimately, Haarmann attracted attention on his own and was responsible for his arrest. On June 22, 1924, Haarmann got into an argument with a 15-year-old boy named Kurt Fromm. Fritz had brought him to his home. Now he turned up with the boy at a police station in Hanover in the middle of the night. Kurt Fromm tells the police that Fritz sexually assaulted him, threatened him with a knife, and held him captive for 4 days in his house on Rote Raya. The police take both men into custody and search an apartment that Fritz occupied on Rote Raya at the time. This time, the search is much more thorough than it was in the Zellerstrasse. Traces of blood are found on a mattress and the walls, as well as on the floorboards. The police are looking for witnesses who can provide information about Fritz Haarmann. While he is in custody, his picture is occasionally shown before public screenings in cinemas. It is hoped that viewers might recognize Haarmann and be able to provide information to the police. As a clothes dealer, Fritz was very active and made many loose contacts. His business was good. It is therefore not surprising that numerous items of clothing for young men were found during the search of Fritz's apartment. However, The police now suspect where he gets his goods from in the first place. No longer from harmless laundry thefts from backyards, but possibly from murders. The police are calling on relatives of missing young men to come and see the clothes. The mother of one missing man recognizes a jacket. It belonged to her son. Another mother runs into Fritz's friend Hans Granz at the police station while he is waiting to be interrogated. The mother recognizes the suit that Hans is wearing. It belongs to her missing son. Fritz is talkative during the interrogations, but he says nothing about the alleged murders. However, he does admit to his homosexuality, which is well documented by the police. In doing so, however, he distorts some truths. For example, Fritz says that all boys are in love with him. He says that it is not he who chases after them, but that all the boys chase after him. He also claims to be propositioned by women on a regular basis, but he rejects all of them. When Haarmann is remanded in custody, the police use cruel methods to extract a confession from him. They place the 4 skulls recovered from the river in his cell, one in each corner. The eye sockets are covered with red paper. Candles are placed in the hollow skulls and lit. In the darkness of the cell, it looks as if the skulls are staring at Fritz with glowing red eyes. The police tell Haarmann that the souls of the dead will come for him if he does not finally come clean. During the interrogations, the police do not shy away from physical violence either. According to notes taken by an investigator and discovered in the 1990s, he was beaten with a rubber hose, among other things. He was repeatedly kicked in the genitals and deprived of sleep. Incidentally, it is very fortunate from the police's point of view that these interrogation methods did not become known at the time, but only decades later. Even in the 1920s, a confession extracted under torture might have been ruled invalid. In the worst case, this could have meant at least a temporary release for Haarmann, giving him another window of opportunity to commit further crimes. On July 1st, 1924, Fritz Haarmann finally breaks. He confessed to having murdered several young men for sexual motives in 1918 and between 1923 and 1924. He could no longer remember the exact number, but admitted that there had been more than 20. He described how he had killed most of them by biting their throats during sex. Or, as Haarmann himself put it, "When I went wild, I bit and clung on." That is why Fritz Haarmann was later given the dubious nickname of the Werewolf of Hanover by a court observer, the philosopher Theodor Lessing. He was referring to old legends he remembered from his childhood, according to which werewolves were damned to bite the throats of defenseless children. When biting wasn't enough, Fritz Haarmann strangled the boys. Fritz also admits to having mostly dismembered the corpses and then thrown them into the Leine. He also washed down a few parts of corpses down the toilet. He had to go to the Leineneufer about 5 or 6 times for each body to make the dead completely disappear. He also deposited a few body parts in the nearby city forest by occasionally throwing individual parts in front of him into the bushes. Fritz tries to present himself better, as a kind of benevolent perpetrator. He claims that he deliberately went to the police station with Kurt Fromm in the hope that the investigators would put him in pre-trial custody. He says he feared he would otherwise have killed Kurt as well, and did not want to commit another murder. 147 missing persons cases were checked for a possible connection to Fritz Haarmann. In 38 cases, the missing persons were found. In another 114 cases, Haarmann could be ruled out as the perpetrator. This leaves 30 cases. Haarmann was ultimately charged with murder in 27 of them. The police consider the following boys and young men to be victims of Fritz Haarmann. You can see their names on the screen now. They were all between 10 and 22 years old. The media interest in the court proceedings against Fritz Haarmann is huge. The gruesome case quickly becomes known internationally. 21 representatives from local and international newspapers are present at the trial. 80 members of the public are also admitted each day. Incidentally, Fritz Haarmann is not standing trial alone. His friend and housemate Hans Granz has been charged with 2 counts of inciting murder and a second charge of receiving stolen goods. The court concludes that Hans helped to lure the victims to Fritz's apartment and was therefore aware of the murders. The police based the charges against Hans on statements made by Fritz Haarmann. The court considers these to be true because there was no reason for Fritz Haarmann to lie. Furthermore, many of Hans Granz's allegations were refuted by other witness statements. Fritz Haarmann is said to have stated that he had told Granz about a murder he committed before he met Hans, namely the murder of Friedel Rothe. This is also considered to be evidence that Granz was at least an accessory. While Fritz always appeared at the meetings dressed in prison clothing, Hans always appeared in a white suit, apparently very concerned about his public image. During his testimony, he consistently refers to Fritz only as Mr. Haarmann, or the defendant Haarmann, thus distancing himself from him. When the trial begins, Haarmann says to the jury, "Make it short. At Christmas, I want to be in heaven with Mother." By this, he means that he hopes to receive the death penalty and that it would be carried out by the end of December so that he could be in heaven with his mother, who died in 1901. Fritz Haarmann says during the trial, "I want to be executed at the Klagesmarkt. On my grave is the saying, 'Here lies the mass murderer Haarmann.' On my birthday, Hans comes and lays a wreath." Fritz Haarmann also expresses the wish that his execution be filmed. Of course, this does not happen, nor does the admission of spectators to the execution. Despite his long medical record, Fritz Haarmann is found fully culpable and thus receives the harshest possible sentence against him. On October 19, 1924, he is sentenced to death. His friend and roommate Hans Granz is also found guilty. He is also sentenced to death. However, Fritz Haarmann intercedes for Hans after the guilty verdict. He writes a letter to the father of Hans Granz, which is leaked to the Hannoversche Allgemeine Zeitung. It is 4 pages long and contains a new version of events. In it, Fritz explains that Hans never witnessed a murder and had no idea that his older roommate was killing people in batches. In doing so, Fritz revised his own statements. Initially, he incriminated Hans during the police interrogation and attributed partial guilt to him. He even initially admitted the following: "Granz didn't just send the boys my way so that I could kill them. Granz didn't just exploit my rage and work me for days, killing boys whose trousers he wanted. Granz committed murder himself, worse than me. Granz and his friend Witkowski lured 17-year-old Adolf Hennies, with whom they had a quarrel over women, into my room and murdered him there. Then they took his clothes and, laughing mockingly, pointed out the body to me when I came home. That's one of yours. I cried and begged them to take the body away. They foisted the dead body on me, ran off, and I had to cut up the body and get rid of it." So at the time, Fritz not only incriminated Hans Granz heavily, but also Hugo Witkowski, who they both knew. When Hugo found out about this, he immediately volunteered to go to court to prove his innocence. Hans Granz maintains throughout the entire time that he had no knowledge of the murders. It is possible that he would not have been sentenced so harshly if Fritz Haarmann had not incriminated him so heavily during the interrogations. After the verdict against him and Hans, Fritz writes in his letter that he only did it because he wanted to take revenge on Hans. He also claims that the police had pressed him to testify against his roommate during the interrogations. He writes, "So help me God, I tell the truth here, and yet I would not like to burden my conscience before God anymore. I, who was sentenced to death. Granz had no idea that I had committed murder. He had never seen anything. Now that my things had been discovered with regard to the murder, I was forced by the local police to say untruths through mistreatment. Out of fear that I would not want to be mistreated anymore, I said yes to everything afterwards. And then I incriminated Granz by telling an untruth. Granz knew nothing of any murder, never saw anything, had no idea. Granz was not even guilty of receiving stolen goods from me. Granz never brought me anyone who had fallen victim to me, and if Granz had known that I was committing murders, Granz would certainly have prevented it." The letter caused a stir, and indeed the death penalty against Hans Granz was suspended for the time being. 4 months later, on April 15, 1925, Fritz Haarmann was executed by guillotine at 6 a.m. in the courtyard of the Hanover District Court. He had previously been given a ham sandwich, cheese, and a cigar as a last meal. During the last months of his life, he enjoyed the cruel attention paid to him. The case of the Werewolf of Hanover was reported all over the world at the time. Haarmann enjoyed the knowledge that almost everyone knew his name. New proceedings against Hans Granz will be opened in 1926. Even during the first trial against him and Fritz 2 years earlier, he always insisted on his innocence. Even in the case of Adolf Hannapel, several witnesses saw how he and Fritz approached Adolf together at the train station. Haarmann also described this case in exactly the same way. But Hans claims not to have suspected that Fritz had murdered Adolf. When he visited Fritz a few days later and saw Adolf's clothes in Fritz's apartment, he simply assumed that Adolf had sold Fritz the clothes. That's exactly what Fritz told him. Hans maintains that he knew nothing about any of the other murders either, even though he lived with Fritz Haarmann for most of that time. Thanks to the letter from Fritz Haarmann, he gets a second chance in the second trial in 1926 to convince the court of his version of events. Nevertheless, he is again found guilty. This time, however, only of complicity, no longer of aiding and abetting. Hans Granz was sentenced to 12 years in prison and served his sentence in Zell, Lower Saxony. In theory, he would have been released in 1936. But before his sentence was up, he was transferred to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp as a criminal. There he lived as prisoner number 123 until the liberation of the camp in April 1945. Hans Granz originally came from a middle-class family. His father worked as a bookseller. Hans went to secondary school and then to a citizen's school. He began an apprenticeship at the Söhlmann metal goods factory. However, the apprenticeship lasted only 9 months. He was dismissed for allegedly stealing money from the company treasury. After that, he kept his head above water with odd jobs in various factories in Hanover and Berlin. In 1919, he lied to his father that he was trying to get a job with the army. When the lie was discovered, contact between Hans Granz and his family was broken off. It was during this period that he met Fritz Haarmann. After his release in 1946, Hans Granz adopted a new identity and lived a free life. He is said to have initially lived in a city in southern Germany and worked as a foreman. Towards the end of his life, he is said to have returned to Hanover, where a journalist claims to have interviewed him in 1973. Granz was said to have been living with a wife in his hometown and was said to have been deeply marked by his imprisonment and his life. He says that Haarmann ruined his whole life. Even into the 1960s, Hans is said to have tried to file compensation claims for his conviction and extended imprisonment in the concentration camp. However, these applications were all rejected. It is said that he ran a kiosk in Hanover from 1974. The rumor is that this kiosk was located opposite a butcher's called Haarmann. 1 year later, in 1975, Hans Granz died at the age of 74. Incidentally, after his execution, Fritz Haarmann's head was kept for research purposes. It was taken to the pathology department in Göttingen and then stored in the Institute of Anthropology. It was not until 2014 that the head was cremated and buried anonymously in a cemetery in Göttingen. A replica of Haarmann's cell can still be seen in the police museum in Nürnberg to this day, along with the original cleaver that he allegedly used to chop up his victims. Over the last 100 years, the Fritz Haarmann case has been covered in the media several times. There is a movie called Der Todmacher, The Butcher, based on this story. It was even nominated for an Oscar as Best Foreign Language Film. The dialogues in the movie were taken from the real interrogation protocols with Fritz Haarmann. If you want to get even deeper into the psyche of Fritz Haarmann, the movie is definitely worth watching. The remains of the murder victims of Fritz Haarmann were buried in a grave of honor at the city cemetery in Hanover in February 1925. A large gray granite stone in the form of a winged altar bears the inscription, "In memory of our dear sons who died between September 1918 and July 1924. Actually, the word murdered should have been on the stone instead of deceased. However, the cemetery administration did not allow this inscription. And that's the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed the review. Were you already familiar with the Fritz Haarmann case? I really appreciate your feedback. If you write a comment, you also automatically support the channel. Every interaction, even a like, increases the likelihood that the video will be suggested to people who have not yet subscribed to Insolito. You can find the link to my other socials like Instagram or Discord in the info box. Thank you very much in advance. Otherwise, there is not much more to say. I wish you a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you watch the video, and hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, ciao guys.